Good morning, everybody. Please take your seats. I know it's a very early session, so it's difficult to be awake so early in the morning after such a long day yesterday. So thank you for making the effort of being early and attending this session, which will focus on a very, very crucial issue. We already heard so much yesterday about this, media viability, what can really be done. For those that were with us in the celebration of World Press Freedom Day last year, you will remember that media viability was one of the three key issues that were addressed. And as such, it was reflected in the Windhoek +30 Declaration, which was the outcome of the International Day last year. It was a declaration that was adopted first by the participants and then endorsed by Unesco's member states. 193 member states have agreed that information is a public good, and that this public good depends on a financial ecosystem that supports media viability. And by that, meaning that provides financial stability to the media, preserves the editorial independence of the media, and fosters quality and investigative journalism. So this is exactly what we're going to be talking about during this hour of this session. A lot has happened since last year. We have heard about different countries adopting measures, adopting legislation, so that their media can survive in the new digital world. And this is what our panelists will be telling us about. Also, we're here because UNESCO has been very busy working on this subject, and particularly the IPDC program, the International Program for the Development of Communication, which is organizing this session. It has been conducting national consultations in more than 10 countries, doing extensive research to identify the formula that are working, studying what can be done in the different realities in the different regions. So the outcome of that research and that work is a policy brief that hopefully you got a copy of. Otherwise, it is outside for you to take, for those who are here presentially. Otherwise, for those that are attending online, you can get it, obviously, from our website. So this policy brief will be presented at this session with some guidance on what can be done at the national, regional, international levels. But before getting into all of that, we have a message from Anna Brandt. She's the chair of IPDC and Sweden's ambassador to UNESCO. So I will ask, please, to play the message that Anna Brandt is sending to this session.
Ladies and gentlemen, on the 3rd of May 1991 in Namibia, journalists at a UNESCO seminar proclaimed the Windhoek Declaration. This became the benchmark for press freedom and media development. At last year's World Press Freedom Day, we saw new and additional challenges recognized by the Windhoek +30 Declaration on information as a public good. The principles of Windhoek +30 were later unanimously endorsed by UNESCO's 193 member states and address the following key challenges: media viability, greater transparency of internet companies, and the need to improve media and information literacy. The overarching challenge, however, is how to maintain the viability of media, because without it, there wouldn't be free and independent media to speak of. Independent press freedom without economically secure media would be an empty shell. This economic crisis for journalism, made starker by the financial impact of COVID-19, is severe. But in the face of this, comprehensive solutions are set out in the new UNESCO policy brief at the heart of the discussion today. The policy brief is supported by the International Programme for the Development of Communication, IPDC, which is leading UNESCO's contribution in the quest for sustainable journalism. The IPDC, which I have the honor to chair, is an intergovernmental initiative in the UN system. 39 UNESCO member states are elected to this body every 2 years, with a mandate to promote media development in developing countries. Acting as a laboratory of ideas for emerging media policy issues, for the past 18 months, IPDC has been putting the viability issues on the international policy agenda. Extensive research has been undertaken. 3 examples. A report, Breaking News, produced by Economist Impact, commissioned by UNESCO. A special chapter in the World Trends in Freedom of Expression and Media Development Global Report 2021-2022. A handbook in 5 languages on inspiring practices at the media outlet level. 2 further activities have added to the momentum. A partnership with the World Association of News Publishers and IPDC-supported consultations and knowledge exchanges between media outlets in 10 countries, carried out by Free Press Unlimited. All these activities have fed into the policy brief, underlining that new support for journalism should never be at the expense of editorial independence or media pluralism. That means, for example, that public subsidies have to be distributed fairly and transparently. Our next steps are now to move forward through roundtables in order to convene stakeholders to discuss the policy recommendations at country level. In doing so, we would move from recommendations at global level to implementation at national level. Today, we have the data and a playbook of policy options on how exactly to go forward. Today, we can see opportunities to secure our current news media outlets. But our ambition should be higher, to expand the sector and to transform it to be more gender sensitive, more socially inclusive, and more professional. Let Montevideo be another milestone in the long walk to a free and sustainable press. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna Brandt, for this message on behalf of IPDC. And let me also welcome here, he's in the room, the Vice Chair of IPDC, Mr. Pablo Medina. Welcome to this session. And also to mention that one of the publications that Ms. Brandt was mentioning, you also have it outside, which is Building Back a Stronger Media. I invite you to get a copy of this publication. So now we will move to the presentation of the policy brief that I was mentioning at the beginning. And for that, we have Julie Posetti, who's the co-author of this policy brief. She's a Global Director of Research at the International Center for Journalists, and she's academically affiliated with the University of Sheffield and Oxford. Thank you, Julie, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, and thank you for coming early to this really important session. This is the policy brief, Finding Funds for Journalism to Thrive, that ICFJ was commissioned to produce. And I wrote this with the inimitable Anja Schifrin, who's one of the world's leading experts on media viability, and Emily Bell from the Tao Center at Columbia University, along with Francesca Edgerton. I just want to start by picking up on some of the points that were made by Ambassador Brandt. And the first one is that the severe financial crisis that threatens the supply of independent journalism also compounds the press freedom threats globally. And I think it's important to emphasise that point, given that we're here for World Press Freedom Day. Because ultimately, there's no point having a thriving business model to support journalism if there is no press freedom and journalists are not safe to practice their craft. But conversely, of course, a free press is futile if it can't afford to eat. And that's literally a reality for many journalists around the world and for many news organisations. So economic viability is crucial because democracy and sustainable development really do rely on independent public interest journalism. That helps to build citizenship, it helps to build peace, it helps to expose malfeasance and to ensure accountable governance. And that's why investments in training and protecting journalists and in defending press freedom are ultimately pointless if there is a constantly declining source of critical independent journalism. And that public interest journalism is so very much at the foreground of our conversations internationally now, particularly up against the challenges of disinformation, viral disinformation, and populist politics, and the tilt towards authoritarianism. We now are in no doubt, certainly from yesterday's opening ceremony, about how that's regarded also, even at the UN level. And the pandemic, of course, has had a drastic impact on media viability, which has further accelerated the steady declines in both independent media and in journalists' jobs. And particularly in the US, we've seen a dramatic shrinkage in local news outlets, for example. But this is a trend internationally. And many existing outlets that have survived the pandemic are still struggling to find business model sustainability, but also audience development sustainability. So the vacuums in pluralistic and accessible journalism really do concern us in terms of what ultimately will become a gap in knowledge, a gap in access to reliable, verifiable information that helps protect us in the context of the pandemic. And of course, all this is happening against a backdrop, as I said, against a rise of authoritarianism, increasing attacks on journalists, and the use of both legal harassment, digital violence, but also the targeting of the economic foundations, in some cases, of journalism, of news. So to withstand these kind of threats, media outlets need not just to be resilient and courageous, but also to have ways to pay their bills and ultimately to eat, as I said. So some of the key trends that we have highlighted in this policy brief, which is, as Rosa suggested, freely available online, and apparently there are also copies, physical copies, because we're actually physically here, which is fantastic, that are available as well. So some of the key trends: pluralism and democracy need economically viable independent media, but we do have this glaring crisis in professional journalism, which is accessible to the public. So one of the things we've identified is the problem of much professional journalism of a high standard in the quest for sustainability being locked up behind paywalls or being less accessible than it used to be. So there is this growing inequality in terms of access to quality journalism. Because as we know, having access to a torrent of information online, which might be free, is not necessarily a way to guarantee access to reliable, credible information. We also have noted, as many others have, that especially in the pandemic, this significant shift away from the ability to rely on advertising has just escalated. More and more of that is going to the digital platforms. And another lens to bring to this discussion is how to foster journalism that supports not just development, but diversity and inclusiveness. And so that means bringing a gender lens, bringing a lens that focuses on the poor, those who are disadvantaged or marginalised in many other ways, so that journalism really is embedded as a public good for social change. We also have noted the rise of multi-stakeholder task forces and commissions of inquiry and a whole range of potential solutions at the state level. So a couple of recommendations to highlight. We've suggested giving tax breaks to local independent news outlets or vouchers for subscriptions, for example, along with subsidies for hiring reporters who might cover some of the critical issues we face, from climate change to poverty alleviation to discrimination. We've also recommended avoiding the cutting of operating budgets for genuinely independent public broadcasters, because in increasing number of contexts, it's often the situation where you only have access in your region or your small town to a public broadcasting service in certain parts of the world. Certainly in my native Australia, that is the case. And we've suggested creating incentives for whistleblowing, for example, which can help expose tax evasion and the misuse of public funds, and then to reward journalism that helps governments recover stolen resources. With regard to the platforms, we've also made a range of recommendations that are designed to ensure that they are investing in independent journalism, but doing so in a way whereby they do not have editorial influence, whether that's covert or overt editorial influence. So we need to be able to establish ways to access those funds, whether it's through examples of bargaining, where governments become involved to offset the losses of the news organisations that have been sometimes subsumed by the shift towards digital advertising and platform-based advertising. This is, I think, a really important challenge, as was highlighted yesterday. So big tech is a big part of the solutions that we're proposing. And finally, to ensure fairness and to avoid marginalisation of local and niche media when it comes to regulation associated with bargaining with the platforms, that this is a way to ensure that it's not just the Murdoch empire, for example, that benefits from these sorts of interventions, but that small, important, community-based news organisations also can thrive. And I'll leave it there and hand over to our colleagues for what I hope will be a stimulating discussion about how we can actually make all this a practical reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for sticking to the time. So based on this presentation by Julie, we move now to our panel, and our panelists will be discussing more in detail some of these options for media viability. So for this, we have 6 panelists. We have to be very strict in terms of time. We have 3 in presentation, we have 3 online. So I would like to start with Danielle Coffey, who's joining us online. I hope that we will see her now on the screen. She is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for the News Media Alliance in the US. Can we see Danielle? There she is. Hello, Danielle. Welcome to this session, and thank you so much for joining us. So based on this presentation that we just heard from Julie, we would like to ask you more in detail. One of the policy options that Julie mentioned and that the brief proposes is to give tax breaks to independent media, subscription vouchers, support for hiring local journalists, she just said. What do you think about this, Danielle? Would it be a good thing? And is it realistic, for example, in your own country, in the US? How do you see this proposal, this option?
Thank you for the question, and thank you very much for having me to talk about the importance of journalism, a free press, and independent press, and all of these important issues. With regard to the question that you're asking having to do with a government, whether it's a tax change that or another form of way of addressing what's happening to our local news coverage across our country, we're very supportive. In fact, when COVID first hit, what we did was we worked with our US Congress and we ensured that small business loans were made available to our local news outlets. And those were called Paycheck Protection Program Forgivable Loans. And that was because of the pandemic. However, at the same time, our US Congress, and this was a couple of years ago, started thinking about ways that they could encourage investment and help local news on top of the PPP loans. So they created the LJSA, the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, that included 3 assisted ways of helping local news coverage, which included a local news payroll tax credit that allowed up to $25,000 a year for each journalist of a publication to have a credit claimed by the parent company. And that could amount to up to $37 million in some cases for companies. It would only last 5 years and it would decrease over years. We also had, as part of that, a subscription tax credit so that the consumer could be incentivized to subscribe to publications. And thirdly, there was an advertising tax credit so that small businesses would be encouraged to advertise with local news outlets. It was both broadcasters and news publishers. We were very supportive. That was about to be passed. And you remember the Build Back Better. President Biden had a spending measure, a resolution that would have gone through. And there was disagreement over how large that was. Senator Manchin voted, there was concern he would vote against it. So now if it's broken off, there's still a possibility of that piece of legislation and assistance to our local news publishers across our country that are at risk because of job losses, because of the pandemic, because of many reasons. We would argue that it's mostly because of the digital platforms, and we have separate legislation to address that. But with regard to government assistance, we were open, which we weren't usually. We like to keep our independence from the government. But in this case, we were supportive of this limited in time measure for remote assistance because it was through a tax credit and it wouldn't be a direct subsidy and interfere with the independence of the Fourth Estate. I hope that answers your question.
Very much so. Thank you very much, Danielle, for this very concrete answer and for sticking to the time. Let me now move to Agustín Espada on my left. He's director of a master's degree in cultural industries at Quilmes University in Argentina, and he's author of UNESCO paper, Impact of the COVID pandemic on media sustainability in Latin America, which was published last year. Agustín, another policy proposal in the policy brief is to ensure that government advertising is independently and transparently disclosed, advertised. How do you see that possible in this region, in Latin America?
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Gracias por la pregunta y gracias por la invitación a participar en este panel tan importante. La publicidad gubernamental, la publicidad estatal es un gran tema de política pública de comunicación en nuestra región porque no tenemos la práctica de contar con subsidios directos a la prensa o por lo menos al periodismo, no de manera institucionalizada, y muchas veces la publicidad oficial, la publicidad estatal, la publicidad gubernamental es utilizada con esos objetivos, cuando en realidad para lo que debiéramos trabajar en nuestras regiones para tener una regulación que establezca justamente estos criterios de transparencia, estos objetivos claros, estos criterios claros de distribución de publicidad y separar de la distribución de publicidad gubernamental, de la distribución de publicidad estatal, lo que creo que es una deuda pendiente en nuestra región, que son los fondos de fomentos directos para la actividad periodística y para la producción de contenidos periodísticos. Ahí entonces tenemos un desafío que se parte en dos. Por un lado, regular, institucionalizar, establecer criterios objetivos, establecer criterios de transparencia en la relación entre los gobiernos y los distintos niveles de Estado y los medios de comunicación en esos servicios publicitarios, siempre teniendo en cuenta que el objetivo principal de la publicidad estatal, de la publicidad gubernamental, debe ser darle información al ciudadano de interés público y llegar al ciudadano, no utilizar esta herramienta específica, especial o principalmente como una herramienta de fomento, y sí trabajar entonces en herramientas, en fondos de fomentos que cuenten con el objetivo de producir procesos anticíclicos, ¿sí? Porque si entendemos que la publicidad estatal, la publicidad gubernamental debe llegar a los ciudadanos, es lógico que se utilicen los canales más utilizados por los ciudadanos, por las audiencias. En cambio, en los fondos de fomento, en los subsidios directos que debemos crear y para los que debemos trabajar en nuestra región, ahí sí podemos pensar y debemos pensar en procesos de financiamiento anticíclicos, ¿sí? Entonces ahí debemos contar con fondos que el Estado Nacional destine directamente de su presupuesto, como bien dice este trabajo, el cual felicito por su excelencia, es muy útil, lo utilizaremos para dar clases y para llevarlo a nuestras maestrías y a nuestras aulas. Como bien dice nuestro trabajo, este fondo debe nutrirse de aportes de las Big Tech, ¿sí? De las grandes plataformas digitales, y yo me animo a proponer también que nos preguntemos si de estos fondos no deben participar también las grandes empresas que proveen los servicios de conexión, que se ven favorecidas por esta ilusión de gratuidad con la cual nosotros consumimos noticias, periodismo y contenidos en Internet, cuando en realidad como usuarios y como audiencias estamos ya pagando grandes abonos para conectarnos a Internet y acceder a esos contenidos. Ahí sí, entonces, la independencia de los medios de comunicación, el fomento a los contenidos locales, a los contenidos diversos, el fomento también a los medios independientes o que no pertenecen a grandes corporaciones, serán cuestiones centrales en la construcción y en la gestión de esos fondos de fomento que, por supuesto, también debemos generar instituciones fuertes que no dependan de los gobiernos o por lo menos que intenten atenuar la influencia de los gobiernos, de los poderes ejecutivos en su gestión. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti, Agustín, por estos útiles comentarios. And I turn now to a panelist who's also joining us online, Paul Deegan. Paul Deegan is President and CEO of News Media Canada, and we're going to see him on the screen, I hope, now. Yeah, there he is. Hello, Paul, and thank you for joining us this morning. Paul, there are some new developments in your country. There's a draft law that is currently being considered that is proposing that platforms pay for the use of media content. And already Canada supports very much local content producers. Can you tell us how do you see going further and having more funding for news startups, for example, or more funding for local content, particularly on public service media? How do you see the situation evolving in the next months in Canada?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the question, and happy World Press Freedom Day to everyone, and especially those present in Uruguay. In Canada, we've done a number of things to support local journalism. The first one, which supports all journalism, is the labor tax credit, which is very important. And essentially, this provides a 25% tax credit to news media organizations, which is really a terrific form of subsidy with minimal government involvement. So that's really the first one. The second one is the Local Journalism Initiative, which supports roughly 200 journalist positions across Canada. It's modeled on a report from for America in the United States, and then the BBC Local Democracy Reporting Service. And it's been a terrific success. It's set up arm's length from government. There's a number of administrator organizations that go through the applications. News Media Canada is one of those organizations. And it's really been a great success. And what it's really done is filling, news deserts across Canada. And it's hugely important. In the budget that was just announced in Canada about a month ago, the government doubled the contribution to the program from 10 million to 20 million for this current year, which is just a terrific initiative from the government. The other one that I would say just generally, and we've had news on this in Canada, and I think we'll discuss on the next panel, is content licensing. That's a way, in Canada, we've introduced legislation which would essentially allow parties to join together in collective negotiation to negotiate with the platforms. And what that does is it allows smaller players that are, that aren't getting calls from the platform to join with larger players and to negotiate collectively and to get meaningful content licensing deals. So that's hugely important. But I think in that context, it's important to remember that not all publications will be part of collective negotiation. They're print-only publications, which don't have a digital presence really to speak of, so they're not part of it. And I think for those smaller print-only publications, it's important to provide transition or funding for them to transition and innovate to the digital world. And the government of Canada provides what are essentially micro grants to help some of those smaller players transition from print to sort of hybrid print digital or to print. The other thing I would say is for those smaller publications, it's important, like the very smallest publications, and in particular the print only, it's important, I think, to have direct subsidies for government for these small local papers. I'm talking about, papers with a distribution of a couple thousand copies. I think without a direct subsidy, it's very difficult for them to survive long term. And those publications are critical to democracy. They cover City Hall, they cover the courts. That's where so many citizens get their information. And so it's important to support those through grants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it looks like we have very good practices from Canada to look at. I will now turn to Luis Ajenjo. Luis Ajenjo is also joining us online, so we're going to see him on the screen very soon. Luis Ajenjo is president of Radio Cooperativa from Chile. There he is. Hello, good morning. He's also the chair of the working group on ICTs of the International Association of Broadcasting. Luis, thank you for being with us. The policy brief recommends setting up multi-stakeholder national commissions or task forces that can look at the situation in each country and identify solutions that are possible in that national context. Would your association, the International Association of Broadcasting, and your members be in favor of such groups, of such action?
Buenos días, muchas gracias por la oportunidad de presentar mis opiniones sobre un tema tan crucial en un foro de esta envergadura. Ante la pregunta específica, por cierto que los medios del sector de difusión vamos a estar dispuestos a participar en las instancias que se creen en cada país, siguiendo las recomendaciones del Policy Brief. Este Policy Brief que está incorporado en el documento base de esta reunión. De hecho, ya lo hemos estado haciendo en la medida que los otros estamentos involucrados han querido participar. Sin embargo, quisiera referirme a lo que me parece una cuestión de fondo. Esta es la necesidad de regular la actividad de las grandes plataformas tecnológicas cuya acción depredadora es lo que está en la base de la crisis de los medios con sus repercusiones sobre la libertad de expresión y finalmente de la democracia, tal como el documento lo señala. Esta regulación, si bien debiera expresarse finalmente en las legislaciones nacionales y en sus políticas de resguardo de la libre competencia, debe ser una tarea asumida globalmente como una responsabilidad de los organismos internacionales y de las economías de los países de mayor tamaño originarias de estos gigantes tecnológicos. Corresponde a los organismos internacionales que han tomado conciencia del daño a la libertad y a la democracia, exhortar a los países miembros a colaborar en una política de detente para limitar la acción de las plataformas. Plataformas que son a la vez proveedores, competidores, reguladores, medidores de audiencia, clientes, analistas de inteligencia, etcétera, etcétera. Con una acumulación de información y poder que los hace incontrarrestables para una empresa e incluso para un país. El tamaño económico de Google, por ejemplo, y de su controladora Alphabet es significativamente mayor incluso que el de muchos países. Confiar en el altruismo de las plataformas me parece ingenuo. El propio máximo ejecutivo de Google, al concurrir al Congreso de los Estados Unidos en el marco de las audiencias para revisar la acción de las plataformas, decía, por favor, regúlennos. Claro, porque su modelo de negocios, centrado en el crecimiento constante, lo obliga a conquistar posiciones a toda costa. Y como ocurre con toda acción monopolística, en un primer momento, ingenuamente, puede aparecer beneficiosa para sus clientes y la sociedad. Lamentablemente, la experiencia muestra el costo social que se asume posteriormente. En este caso, tratándose de bienes nobles, como la información, la entretención y la educación, entre otros, los daños serán mucho mayores. Estas plataformas no pueden ser altruistas, es decir, no pueden realizar acciones desinteresadas. Estarían desatendiendo sus obligaciones con sus accionistas. Todas las iniciativas que han emprendido en el mundo de la información y los medios son concordantes con sus estrategias de largo plazo. Para los medios formales, la incorporación al mundo digital es algo natural. Diarios, canales de televisión y radio, hemos encontrado en Internet una extensión de nuestras actividades. En Chile, por ejemplo, mi país, los principales medios informativos online hoy día somos los mismos que por décadas encabezamos los rankings de lectoría y de audiencia. Hemos abrazado lo que ya hace 30 años llamamos las nuevas carreteras de la superinformación y hemos llevado al mundo digital los estándares de responsabilidad editorial que ha permitido conservar la confianza del público. Esto desmiente, a mi juicio, la afirmación pretenciosa e interesada que señala que la tecnología nos ha dado una sobrevida. No somos más que lo que el público valora, pero no aceptamos ser menos. Entre todos los perjuicios que ha conllevado la acción descontrolada de las plataformas, está la de las noticias falsas. Quisiera referirme a una de sus especies, como es aquella que se toma de un famoso y ocupando la imagen de un medio formal, engaña ofreciendo recetas para ser millonarios, para enseñar técnicas dudosas, para sanar incurables, para vender pócimas milagrosas, o cobrar por algo que es normalmente gratuito. Es posible que las buenas prácticas que Google pretende imponer desde su monopólico navegador Chrome no sean capaces de impedir estos engaños que se nos cuelan a los medios formales a través de categorías de avisos inocentes como educación. ¿O se trata más bien que su función de maximizar el tráfico y la venta de avisaje es más importante en su estrategia que impedir los abusos? La línea correcta en la regulación debe estar en impedir el cruce de actividades en mercados conexos, limitar el tamaño, obligar a la división en unidades independientes, exigir la desinversión efectiva, desalentar el crecimiento constante, inducir compulsivamente la desegregación de actividades, reducir también su influencia en el mundo académico y en las instancias gremiales de asociación. Finalmente, quisiera decir que los avances en obligar a pagar por el uso de los contenidos de terceros creadores, como somos los medios, el caso australiano y esperamos que próximamente Canadá, están en el camino correcto, pero no serán suficientes sin una regulación efectiva como la que hemos reseñado. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a usted, Luis Ajenjo. Thank you very much for these comments. So we get a yes to these national task forces, but with a focus on big tech and how the big tech can pay for the use of media content. So let me now turn to my right, to Marcelo Rech. Welcome, Marcelo. Thank you for being here. Marcelo is president of the National Association of Newspapers in Brazil. And based on Brazil's history of internet governance, also based on the recent developments and the so-called fake news bill in your country, how do you see the possibility or how digital regulations could benefit in Brazil media viability, and why are journalists and media divided about this?
Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate Julie and for the accurate and broad paper, especially the pros and cons of every alternative. So it's, in my perspective, a very innovative approach to the issue. And it's an important contribution from Unesco to the ecosystem. And Rosa, in countries highly polarized like Brazil, it's an insane task to find a common ground to approve regulation like that. So it's not, if it's not easy in Canada, it's not easy in Australia, in France, in Germany. Can you imagine in Brazil, where we barely can agree which day is today? And that's why I think that having a regulation is better than nothing, but it's not the most efficient way to tackle with the disinformation. I think the best and healthiest way to deal with this situation is to have more and better journalism in a large scale. And the logic is very simple. The big techs, the digital giants, in their production process, they produce as a secondary effect a social pollution, translated by disinformation, hate speech, and everything else. And it's simple. The polluters have to pay for the cleanup of the pollution. The cost of the cleanup must be paid by the polluters. And I think that going country by country, finding local regulations could be not just insane, as I mentioned in the case of Brazil, but it's a so long way that I doubt that we can do it in less than 1 or 2 or 3 generations. Because if you see the strategy of the big techs of dealing with regulation is to procrastinate this discussion as much as possible in every country. So I think that we need a global coordination through the method of a self-regulation, because I think that preserving and improving journalism is in the best interest also of the digital giants. Having democracy is in the interest of also the digital giants. So you see what's going on with the social media and the big techs in Russia, where there is no freedom of the press at all. So it's a case that we have to see in the perspective of having journalism to improve democracy and also to improve their business. You know? And I think that I advocate a self-regulation, a global agreement for, it could be either a global bargain codes adapted to local ecosystems, or a global fund to sustain, to preserve, to improve, and to develop journalism, including new initiatives, innovation, and so on. That's my view in this situation.
Well, thank you very much for these comments and for this reflection on how the solution can come from the global level, global coordination, as you call for. Let me now move to our last but not least speaker, Mijal Iastrebner from Argentina. She's a journalist and she's co-founder of Sembramedia, which is very well known in the region and also at the international level, encouraging media entrepreneurship in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mijal, tell us please all these options for media viability that we are discussing this morning. How can they, through the different schemes that could be possible in the different countries, how can they trigger innovation and transformation in media enterprises so that they also they become more inclusive, we move towards models that are more diverse, gender equal? How do you see that happening?
Gracias, Rosa. Hola a todos. Hi, everyone. En Sembramedia nos enfocamos en la sustentabilidad, en la viabilidad de los medios y en cómo enfocar esos liderazgos y estrategias. Y cuando pensamos en las distintas maneras de apoyar a los distintos medios que están cubriendo un rol de llevar un servicio a cabo, nos encontramos con distintas nociones de qué es la sustentabilidad. Y si partimos de esa base, la sustentabilidad es la capacidad de planificar con recursos y liderazgo los próximos desarrollos de esa organización para que pueda seguir siendo independiente y sirviendo a la comunidad, al interés público. Entonces, si nosotros solamente seguimos pensando en la sustentabilidad como el dinero en el banco, corremos un montón de riesgos. Y si bien hay un montón de riesgos en términos de alcance, de relevancia y demás, como se está conversando acerca de las distintas plataformas de distribución y las distintas regulaciones, también hay un montón de dificultades que tienen que ver con que la organización en sí sea capaz de cumplir el objetivo de tener un impacto social. Un medio tiene que tener como principal valor y objetivo tener un impacto social y brindar un servicio de manera independiente. La manera de hacerlo independiente es a través de tener una estrategia de diversificación de fondos en las que se puedan tomar decisiones en el curso, así como cambian muchísimo las realidades de nuestros países, económicas, sociales, políticas, que tengamos la capacidad de tomar decisiones, de tener personas preparadas para tomar decisiones que tienen que ver con proteger a esa libertad de expresión y a su vez proteger a las personas que están garantizando esa libertad de expresión, a sus equipos, a el entorno de trabajo. No podemos pensar, esto ha tomado muchísimo el asiento trasero durante muchísimos años y ahora estamos tratando de catch up con la cultura organizacional que tienen nuestros medios. Y para poder ponernos al día necesitamos líderes en los medios. Y tanto el dinero como el management han sido un tabú en el periodismo durante muchísimos años, un tabú que no podemos seguir sosteniendo y que estas conversaciones empujan hacia adelante e incentivan a que podamos pensar en que tienen que haber roles en la organización, tiene que haber una planificación en la organización para que se pueda garantizar un entorno con una cantidad de valores que después se puedan transmitir al trabajo que hace el medio a nivel periodístico, a nivel servicio social. Todo esto, obviamente, se tiene que hacer con estrategias de sustentabilidad, de financiación, y requieren de core funding, requieren de financiamiento estructural. Y para eso también tenemos que, como financiadores y como organizaciones de apoyo a los medios, tenemos que entender que es muy importante brindar subsidios, entrenamiento, el dinero solo no es una garantía para impulsar estas habilidades que ninguno de los periodistas de esta generación hemos aprendido en nuestra formación como periodistas. Entonces, para hacer ese catch-up necesitamos realmente poner atención en el liderazgo y el management para transformar estas organizaciones y para que sean organizaciones ágiles que pueden seguir siendo vigentes y sustentables, relevantes, en un entorno completamente cambiante y acelerado como en el que vivimos.
Muchas gracias, Mijal, for reminding us that it's not only about money, but it's also about leadership, good management, and training. Thanks a lot for these comments. So thank you all panelists for being for sticking so much to the available time. And actually, we have a few minutes even for some questions, which I haven't seen in any of the other sessions. So congratulations to all of you. I don't know if we have any question from the room. It's possible to ask for a mic and ask a question if there's any. Otherwise, I will invite the panelists to maybe conclude. We have a question there. Sir, you want to ask a question? A mic for the gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Mahmoud. I come from Sierra Leone. I work for BBC Media Action. we have in our presence the Minister of Information and Communication from the government of Sierra Leone, who made a statement yesterday. We are already moving towards a pathway that's been discussed here, and a week before World Press Freedom, Sierra Leone organized the first ever Media Viability and Investment Conference. And the country has developed a roadmap, and much of the things we've been talking about are already in that national action plan, which the government of Sierra Leone and its media partners, through the support of the Prime Project by BBC Media Action, is already doing. So my question is, in a country that's already at the forefront of taking up these concrete actions, are there anything from experience in other parts of the world that the minister here and his team should be aware of, things to avoid and what to pay specific attention to? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and welcome to the Minister from Sierra Leone. It's a pleasure to have you in this session. I don't know if who would like to. Julie wants to answer. Go ahead, Julie.
Thanks very much. First of all, I'm familiar with one of the NGOs that operates in Sierra Leone, New Narratives, which is an interesting model, and I just want to highlight the effort to make journalism sustainable, not just in the sense of leadership transformation and economic viability, but in terms of ensuring that local communities can actually produce media in a sustainable way, which has not necessarily been the thrust of interventions in Sierra Leone before, as I understand it, and other parts of the world as well. There are, I think, many lessons to be taken from really innovative, robust news organizations, not necessarily in the West, but in places like the Philippines. I would just point to Rappler, which I know is a case study well known now, but the ability to respond innovatively and to diversify revenue streams while being persecuted by the state, and also while having your CEO threatened with 100 years in jail, and managing to break even and become profitable, is something to really celebrate. And I'm talking there about Maria Ressa as the CEO of Rappler. They have actually managed to diversify into research services and other forms of really novel revenue raising in connection with their journalism. So they focus on the sustainability of democracy, they focus on disinformation, and they apply really high-level research and analysis expertise, which they've developed over time, not just to their journalism, but to actually respond to the threats in their communities and to help communities, for example, navigate disinformation. And I think that is definitely one of the case studies I would urge you to have a look at, and that's been written about extensively, including in several reports that I authored for the Reuters Institute. So that would be my encouragement. Take that as an example. I think too often we look to large Western news organizations as examples, and I think other better examples can be found.
Well, thank you, Julie, for that response. I see another question to the lady.
¿Cómo están? Buenos días. Mi nombre es Paula Moreno, vengo desde Argentina, desde el Foro de Periodismo Argentino. La pregunta es, ¿cómo imaginan la participación de las organizaciones de periodistas en este proceso en el que tenemos que discutir definitivamente la regulación de la publicidad oficial y también tenemos que discutir cómo salvar o proteger nuestros contenidos editoriales? ¿Cómo imaginan la presencia de las organizaciones de periodistas en ese proceso?
Muy bien, muy clara la pregunta. No sé, a mi derecha o a mi izquierda, si quieren contestar.
Bueno, yo creo que los periodistas y las organizaciones de periodismo son centrales en la discusión, ¿no? Porque son protagonistas y son los que sufren directamente los efectos de la crisis sistémica que nosotros estamos observando por el mundo. Son los primeros a sentirlos porque las redacciones se quedan cada vez más fracas, o se cierran vehículos, los empleos están desapareciendo, y en lugar de los periodismo profesional se viene un gangsterismo digital. En los desiertos de noticias que vemos en Brasil, que vemos en varias partes de América Latina, del mundo, no hay vácuo. En lugar de periodismo viene el gangsterismo, los bandoleros digitales que ocupan ese espacio. Así que tener la presencia, voy a dar un ejemplo de Australia, que no es una información secreta, porque el Columbia Journalism Review ha hecho un excelente reportaje a pocas semanas en su edición sobre los efectos de la ley australiana en el ecosistema australiano de periodismo. Uno de los ejemplos apenas. Gracias a la nueva ley del Bargain Code de Australia, Australian Broadcast Corporation, es una red de televisión, ha contratado 55 periodistas para ocupar espacios donde no había cobertura o la cobertura estaba muy fraca en diferentes partes de Australia. Así que es de alto interés. Yo creo que uno de los criterios, es una posición personal, pero que uno de los criterios, y lo más importante criterio de una regulación para la transferencia de recursos de los poluidores a quien combate la polución es el número de periodistas contratados por el vehículo o por la organización periodística. Un segundo criterio sería la cantidad y la calidad del contenido original que se produce periodismo, ¿no? Entonces, creo que es central, es muy importante tener la colaboración, la voz y la participación, el entusiasmo de los periodistas por una solución que no es solo para el periodismo, como dice, es para la sanidad mundial, es para la civilización, porque el fin del periodismo es el fin de la civilización.
30 segundos, Mijal, porque tenemos que cerrar.
No, sumo que también creo que estas organizaciones, como muy bien lo hacen FOPEA, Brach, son importantes para trabajar en contextos de polarización, donde también es muy complejo llegar a acuerdos y trabajar por objetivos comunes y regulaciones entre distintos medios en contextos extremadamente polarizados en los que algunos medios se benefician con distintas situaciones políticas o gubernamentales. Entonces, creo que es un rol muy central también traer no solamente ese debate y combatir la brecha, sino también hacer un trabajo a nivel nacional, como sé que lo hace excelentemente FOPEA.
Muchas gracias, Mijal. Muchas gracias a todos los panelistas. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you in this session. And please know that we will have several other sessions this morning dealing with the specific issue of media viability. So thank you all. And I invite you now to leave the stage. Thank you.